Alrighty. Well, hi everyone, and welcome to today's Red Hill Rediscovered program, French Aid During the Revolutionary War. My name is Cody Youngblood, and I'm the Director of Historic Preservation and Collections here at Patrick Henry's Red Hill. And I'm really excited to welcome my friend Randy Flood for today's event. Randy is an experienced teacher of the American Revolution, and I know a lot of folks don't know too much about the French and their contributions during the war, so I'm excited to have him here today. So Randolph G. Flood is the host and executive producer of the Real American Revolution Multimedia Center and Consortium for Civic Education, a nonprofit organization established to educate Virginians and the American people about what really happened during our American Revolution. At present, Randy is producing a documentary about the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route in Virginia, which includes 15 of the most publicly accessible sites along the route from Mount Vernon to Yorktown. He's also working with the Children of the American Revolution organization to develop an educational video program featuring young people interviewing historical figures of our early colonial period. Currently, he teaches over 40 classes about the American Revolution with a particular focus on offering professional development certification to help Virginia history and social science teachers educate their students about our early American heritage. So with that, Randy, I will let you take it away here with your wonderful presentation. And again, folks, if you have any questions, please do leave them in the comment section and we'll answer them at the end. So Randy, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Cody. I really appreciate you inviting me to participate. And thanks to our viewers today to learn about the American Revolution, particularly as France got involved. And so I'm going to click one thing here to see. Obviously, the title is French Aid During the American Revolution. And there you have a young Louis XVI. This is a little bit older picture of him, but he became king of France in 1774, succeeding his grandfather, Louis XV. And so you also see a map of what was then France, and hasn't changed too much in 250 years, but that's what it looked like in that particular time period. So when people think of the American Revolution and they think of France's role, I think the first, through popular culture and movies and things like that, I think the first thing that comes to mind is probably Lafayette. And then as far as their involvement in the American Revolution, I think they probably focus on Benjamin Franklin. You know, Franklin goes over to France. We need France's aid, or anybody who come to our aid, because, you know, we just didn't have the capability to go up against the greatest nation in the world at that time with a great professional army. And so we were looking to France and other nations to help us. And Ben Franklin goes over there with his magic wand. And after several months of trying, he's unable to convince the king. And then all of a sudden, the miraculous Battle of Saratoga occurs, and France jumps in with both feet. Well, both of those things are highly stretched. First and foremost, Franklin was not the only person to get involved. In fact, he actually had a lot of the work was done before he ever got there in France. And secondly, Saratoga was certainly not the turning point of the American Revolution. It was one of many significant battles that helped the Americans achieve victory from the perspective of a world looking at what was happening over here, but it certainly wasn't the turning point in the war. We didn't win a single battle after Saratoga for 35 months until a little battle in the south called Kings Mountain. And then that began to turn the tide for the Americans. So we weren't looking too good in when France first got involved, but they were very instrumental. So let's talk about that. Let's focus on today's objectives. First of all, why did Louis help us? He had no reason to. He didn't exactly have an agenda to help us. It kind of came up during discussions with his ministers. But we're going to be talking about why he got involved, why he committed France to helping us to win our war for independence. We're also going to examine the types of aid, which are really important, which helped us win our war for independence against Great Britain. And with all the classes that I teach, I try to integrate history and civics and world geography, historic preservation, those types of things that are so important. And since a lot of the students with whom I talk are interested in STEM or STEAM, we try to integrate those into the presentations to the extent wherever it's appropriate. So let's talk about why did France help the English colonies? Well, it boils down to really two major reasons. Number one, Okay. Number one, revenge against Great Britain. If you see the map on your left there, you see where most of North America was really claimed by France. We're talking about almost an entire continent where France had explored, claimed many boundaries along riverfronts, those types of things, and they really had a huge, huge impact in North America. Trading with Native Americans for furs, doing a lot of things to expand their empire around the world. But the British also had a footprint, and they were the English colonies along the eastern seaboard of what is now the United States. I don't know why this map reflects that the Hudson Bay area is British, because there were Native Americans up there, there were Dutch and there were French, but there were very few English. So they might have claimed it, but nobody lived there that was English. And of course, that was before 1754. And then, of course, we had the French and Indian War as we know it in America, or what we call the 7 Years' War in Europe and around the world, where England challenged France for control of North America. And after those long years of warfare in 1763, France was humiliated, defeated worldwide, but particularly here in America, and they gave up literally the entire continent. The area that's known that we call Louisiana was actually ceded by France to Spain because Spain and France both had Bourbon family members on the court that were basically both kings, King Charles of Spain III, and also, of course, Louis the XVI, and as a result, Louis the XV as well. And as a result, Spain was given by France the Louisiana Territory, as we would call it today. But otherwise, all of the rest of North America was really claimed by the British after that humiliating defeat by the British. And as it turns out, you see that little proclamation line. I'm glad they put that in there because basically, in order to get Americans to support the French and Indian War here in America, the British government told we Americans in all of our 13 colonies, they said, look, if you support our efforts, all that land to the west, all the way to the Mississippi, from the Appalachians will be yours to settle. It was an incentive. Those of us in Virginia who were growing tobacco needed new land to move to because tobacco, after so many years, ruins the soil, and you have to move further to continue to gain more land to be able to grow more tobacco. And of course, you have early patriots like Patrick Henry and George Mason, Thomas Jefferson, even Benjamin Franklin that were involved in land speculation. They saw the potential of the rich Ohio Valley, fertile ground for growing crops and those types of things, and navigating the waters of the Ohio and the Mississippi. And it was a great opportunity for them to expand. But of course, there became a royal proclamation from King George III, basically, who said, look, I've changed my mind. That's going to be an Indian reserve. That'll be like the Indian territory all the way from the Appalachians to the Mississippi, because I want that to be a buffer zone. We have to raise money to pay to station troops there to protect you all, but you cannot cross the Appalachians. We need to buy more time. That should be a buffer zone against the potential spread of Spanish looking at us and looking at our land, because they wanted the land from the Appalachians to the Mississippi. So rather than set up a confrontation with Spain, this Indian reserve was hollowed out, but that made a lot of Americans very, very angry because they were already beginning to settle across the mountains. And of course, France was just sitting back and watching this and watching the slow burn of the Americans as these rights of going over the mountain and westward expansion were taken away. So that's the first reason, revenge against Great Britain. You're humiliated, you lose an entire continent, you need to find a way to get back at Great Britain for what they did to you. The second reason really is to develop closer ties with these American colonies. These American colonies were not thinking United States of America in 1763. They were thinking independent colonies, which eventually came together as a confederation of nation states. For example, we could not trade directly with France. We couldn't trade directly with Spain. We couldn't trade directly with the Dutch Republic. Everything that we could produce in the colonies, whether it's tobacco or goods or whatever, wheat, corn, those types of commodities, had to be shipped on British ships crewed by British crews, we couldn't trade directly with other nations around the world. What did we do as a result? Well, some of us obeyed the law, but a lot of us just simply smuggled. Smuggling was a major issue that was one of the real major causes of the American Revolution. And it did start with the Navigation Acts, which prohibited us to send certain goods on ships other than British. And so what happened is that France saw an opportunity to trade with 13 different nations. They weren't thinking United States of America either. Furthest thing from their mind, they were looking at opportunities for trade to develop commercial ties with these American colonies if they could break away from Great Britain. But obviously that's a dangerous proposition when you were defeated or humiliated. So the French were mulling it over, and you might say it was a real problem because how do you provide support even if you wanted to when you've got the British government that has a treaty in place, which is the Treaty of 1763, where France acknowledges its humiliation and it's no longer the player in Europe that it wanted to be. So the French government doesn't want another war. They have to rebuild. They've got weapons they need to replace. They've got goods they need to have upgraded. They have a lot of things that would help them be a world power again against Great Britain, but they're shy of doing it. They want to be very careful, so they're going to do it behind the scenes. A general, which we'll talk about later, Rochambeau, was actually put in charge of rebuilding the French army and the navy quietly, low key, under the table, you might say. So Vergennes is the minister at the time, and he wants to find out what's really going on in the American colonies. Well, who is this guy, Vergennes? I mean, what role does he play? You hear his name occasionally. Most Americans never heard of him or know anything about him, but he was a brilliant French diplomat. When you talk about diplomacy, this guy had it in spades. He was really, really good at negotiating and putting France in a position where it had the advantage in many instances. So he served as foreign minister from 1774 to 1787. So that's before, during, and after the American Revolution. And it was really Vergennes who sent Rochambeau, the leader of the French forces, over here to really help us. So he was really somebody. He was really significantly involved. And once he got involved, the king was more comfortable with moving in that direction as well. So Vergennes wants to find out what's really going on over there. We have to proceed very cautiously. I don't want the king to be embarrassed. I don't want to be embarrassed. What's going on? So he sent some spies over here because he knew that the members of the Continental Congress were meeting in late 1775. So he wanted to find out what was going on. So they hung out in taverns and other locations, talking and debating the issues. And what these spies learned, and by the way, France had a tremendous spy network. All the countries in Europe had great spy networks, and spying on what's going on and learning policy decisions and transmitting that information back to their monarchs. But they found out in these discussions that people were really sore about being limited by this royal proclamation of King George III of going west. And then, to make matters even worse, not only were we violating that proclamation and continuing to go over the Appalachians and settling and buying land, either legitimately or illegally from the Indians, the point being is we were gaining areas that we were not supposed to be in. And so basically the British government decided, well, we know you're violating the proclamation. We can't move you back because you don't want to go back. So what they decided to do legislatively is extend the boundaries of the Quebec Act. Quebec is obviously a major province in Canada. It was allowed after the French and Indian War to be governed by Catholic leaders and therefore their own jurisdiction. And so they extended the boundaries of the Catholic government of Quebec all the way down into the Ohio Valley, which means that they're saying to us, okay, we know you're going over the Appalachians. We don't want you to do that. But if you want to do that, here's the risk you run. If you go across the Appalachians, you start settling in the Ohio Valley, you're running the risk of starting a religious war. The same type of wars, the religious wars that you wanted to flee in Europe, you're going to start one over here because you've got a Catholic government and you all are Protestant colonies. Even though Maryland was founded by the Catholics, Lord Calvert, nevertheless, we were under the British government, and therefore we were Protestant. So they said, if you want to run that risk and start a religious war in Europe, go right ahead. So that really infuriated us as well. But you won't read about the Quebec Act of 1774 in many history books. And of course, we do have certain taxation and regulatory measures which were imposed without the consent of the colonial assemblies, because Britain was the power that it was. Sometimes it didn't need to listen to the representatives of each of these colonies. So inevitably, Vergennes listened to these spies. He gathered a lot of information, and so it's time for him to make a decision. He wants to have some clarity. He wants to know what really is happening in America. He gets the information from the spies. That's enough to go on, but he needs to have some kind of official word of who these leaders are and what their plans are. So he sends a Mr. Bonvoyer over here, who meets secretly at night in Carpenter's Hall during December of 1775 with two of the leaders of the, what you'd call the soon-to-be rebellion. And he's got Ben Franklin and John Jay and an interpreter there. And he basically probes to them what would happen if, and I'm not saying which nation would be interested, but what would happen if some nation could come forward and provide you with arms, ammunition, tents, uniforms, money, medicine, etc. Would you be interested? Would you be interested in forming an alliance to consider, in consideration of your war against Great Britain? And of course, we resoundingly said yes, absolutely. So Bonvoyer goes back, and he basically talks to the king, and he talks to Vergennes, and Vergennes turns to a gentleman whom he knew for a lot of ways, doing a lot of things for France. And they decided, basically, the bottom line is they decided to fund a company, a dummy company that was set up by this gentleman by the name of Pierre-Augustin Caron Beaumarchais. And they basically provided him with the equivalent, Louis provided him with the equivalent of 8.5 million today. And King Charles, the other Bourbon on the throne of Spain, gave him another 8.5. And then Beaumarchais goes to the private sector and says, look, we have an opportunity to make some money as well as to provide goods to these 13 colonies that are trying to break away from Great Britain. You need to benefit from this, and you will. So you need to kick in something as well. So he comes up with that largest amount of money, and he gets permission from Louis XVI to buy war surplus from the armories and the warehouses throughout France. Now, bear in mind, France had antiquated weapons. They need to have new Charlevilles. They had 5 Charleville company armories in France, but they needed to upgrade their weaponry. We're talking about a wholesale, complete redo, if you will, of the military, both the Army and the Navy that Rochambeau was in charge of, to do this jumpstart, if you will, of France again. So you have a lot of surplus left over. After World War II, of course, we had Quonset huts at all these major military bases where young men could get their Boy Scout supplies at these Quonset huts, which was government surplus. And we still have government surplus areas today. So what Beaumarchais did was he bought all this surplus, this materials, these blankets, extra blankets, things of that nature. And he put them on wagons. And of course, they moved them to warehouses along the coast in France to be transported, hopefully, eventually to America once they got the green light to do so. Well, who was this Beaumarchais? Well, he came from a watchmaking family. He was an inventor. He was also a playwright. He wrote The Marriage of Figaro, The Barber of Seville, The Guilty Mother, diplomat, spy, horticulturist, but more importantly, arms dealer. And so he did work with 2 gentlemen in particular. One of them was the American envoy, Silas Deane. We'll talk about him in a second. And then there was a Chevalier Dion, who was also kind of a go-between, a major spy. And the 3 of them worked together to try to basically position the Rodriguez Hortalis Company as a major vehicle for transporting goods to America. So he really played a huge role in France, and that statue of him, I think, is in Paris. In any event, now, I mentioned the Chevalier Dion. I don't want to get into a lot of detail here, but simply the fact that when they were negotiating the Treaty of 1763 to end the war, he was on the negotiating team. He was in London to gather, and he gathered information about, but Louis XV, even though France had lost the 7 Years' War, or as we call it, the War the French and Indian War here in America, he was still thinking about invading. He was not sure he wanted to make this treaty. So Louis the 15th, that's the grandfather of Louis the 16th, he was actually planning an invasion. And it would have been ill-fated because I don't think France was prepared to do anything and really invade England at the time. But the Chevalier stayed over there and he gathered information and he hoarded it because he wanted to have a better lifestyle. He wanted to eventually use it as blackmail to say that I've got information that I can share with the rest of the world, but it'll be embarrassing to the king. But he held that information very closely. So when that king died, Louis the 15th, his grandson came in, and Beaumarchais learned about this potential blackmail, and so they were trying to figure out how can we get the Chevalier to turn over information that will not be embarrassing to the new king, and what do we do? What kind of a deal do we have to make? And Chevalier was really interested in not only increasing his own wealth, but he was interested in actually helping the American cause and doing what he could, since he had all this valuable information, perhaps more than anybody else from France, about what Britain was doing and how they were responding to the colonies. So they finally worked out a deal, and the Chevalier came back. He basically came back and he started working with Beaumarchais to make sure that all these goods were being lined up to be sent to America. And it also convinced Virginians, because of the sensitivity of this information, it could be embarrassing to show that Louis XV was actually going to renege on the treaty and invade England, was able to be in a position to really help out Beaumarchais. So in any event, who was the Chevalier? Well, he was a brilliant diplomat, spy. He was also a cross-dresser. He appeared as a man for 50 years and then lived for the last 33 years of his life as a woman. So go figure. But he was a strange guy, but he certainly was a intriguing go-between in the spy network of gaining information that enabled France to position itself to send goods to America and smuggle them in. Well, in any event, Rodrigo Hortalis was very successful. It was really created officially by Beaumarchais in May of 1776, and they really began to hoard all kinds of supplies to be sent to America: artillery, arms, ammunition, tents, uniforms, money, medicine, those types of things, and also began to selectively send military advisors, not troops, but military advisors with expertise in areas that the Americans did not have. We did not have a West Point yet to train military officers or infantry. We did not have any artillery factories in America. We certainly didn't know a lot about fortifications and siege warfare. And as far as cavalry, nobody could really fight on horseback. We didn't have a cavalry to speak of. So they were willing to send all these supplies. And we're talking about at least 7 or 8 months before Saratoga. They were doing that, but they were not sending any French troops. So, in fact, what do you do? Well, what you do is you continue to send this type of information, and you begin to identify leaders that might be helpful. Now, there's one leader who necessarily wasn't identified at the outset, but he got an interest in the American Revolution, and that was Lafayette. As a soldier being trained at Metz, which was the West Point, you might say, of France, Lafayette was under the command of basically a Comte de Broglie, who was a brilliant officer in and of himself. And they began talking, and Broglie said, well, you know, the war in America is very exciting, and I know you've heard something about this man by the name of George Washington. And Lafayette's eyes just lit up. He really wanted to come to America, and he was inspired by Washington and what he thought was the American cause. And so Broglie says, well, I think you should probably do that. He actually encouraged them to think about that. And so what happened was that Lafayette was interested in coming to America, and he did just that. Well, who was Lafayette? Well, you know already a lot about him because we just celebrated the 200th anniversary of his return to America. But in fact, he was born into a very, very aristocratic family. He married well. His wife was part of the Noel family, which was very, very wealthy. His father-in-law bought him a regiment, and he became a commander there. He also, when he came over here in America, he actually went to the Continental Congress and said, I'd like to, offer my services. And they said, we don't have the money to pay you. And Lafayette basically said, well, you don't have to pay me. I'm independently wealthy. I'll cover all my expenses, my staff, and everything else. And they said, what would you like? And then they gave him a major generalship, and they assigned him to work with George Washington. So that's a rush to stardom very quickly. So he did participate in some of the early battles. Washington didn't want him getting involved too much because he was fearful that if Lafayette were killed or injured in some way, that would reflect poorly on his judgment to bring someone so young aboard. But Lafayette was a good officer. He knew military tactics much earlier than most people do, and he was a good officer, particularly when he was shifted in command of troops down here to monitor and follow what Cornwallis was doing in the South prior to the Battle of Yorktown. Well, in any event, Lafayette got involved because he knew Baron de Kalb, and Baron de Kalb was one of his mentors. He was a brilliant general who had fought in wars in Europe, and Baron de Kalb knew Silas Deane. Silas Deane was he was the first American envoy to be sent to France when Benjamin Franklin and several others were thinking, well, let's probe France. Let's find out if they're really interested in helping us, or to what extent France or any other nation would be interested in helping us. So Deane goes over there. He meets with Vergennes, he meets with Baron de Kalb, and he meets Lafayette. Well, Louis XVI, as I said, was very cautious about getting involved with the Americas. He didn't want to put himself in a position where he's reneging on this treaty that they had signed in 1763 to end the war. And he basically, he heard that Lafayette wanted to go to America. So he basically told him, okay, I order you to remain in France. Don't violate my order. You have to stay on your estate. I just don't want you going anywhere near America. Well, put yourself in Lafayette's position for a minute. He's 19 years of age. He's got all the money in the world. He's got roots all over France. Comes from one of the richest families in France, and he married well, so they're very wealthy. So you've got all the money in the world, and your king tells you can't go to America. So what are you going to do? Well, he goes to America, and he takes several of his colleagues and French officers with him. So obviously, the king was angry, and they settled up later. But the bottom line is that Lafayette defied the king, came over here, and decided to invest his own savings in helping the American cause. Well, who was Silas Deane? He doesn't appear in history books. Well, Silas Deane was born in Groton, Connecticut, educated at Yale. He was actually one of the few people who saw the vision of creating an American Navy. He was a member, obviously, of the First Continental Congress, and he was sent by the Congress, and specifically Ben Franklin, to negotiate whatever was possible to try to get France involved. And it was Silas Deane. It wasn't Ben Franklin. It was Silas Deane who brought Lafayette over here, and de Kalb. He knew de Kalb prior to Lafayette. He also brought Pulaski, Steuben, and a bunch of others as well. Now, Franklin gets the credit for bringing everybody over, but he didn't do that. All this heavy lifting was actually done by Silas Deane. In fact, Silas Deane did such a good job of the heavy lifting and laying the foundation that Franklin decided to go over himself. And also Arthur Lee, who actually had been in England because he had business ties with England. He was part of the Lee family in Virginia and enjoyed England very much, and so he became part of this diplomatic intrigue, if you will, to try to get France involved. One has to question how serious Lee was, since he didn't want to damage his business dealings or the Lee family's business dealings, which is ironic given the fact that his brother, Richard Henry Lee, offered the Resolution of Independence from the Virginia General Assembly. And his other brother, Francis Lightfoot Lee, was also involved in the independence movement in America. But Arthur Lee, in any event, appeared in France in late December along with Ben Franklin to team up with Silas Deane. Now, Franklin and Deane were really Renaissance people. They were really men of the world. Both of them were very brilliant. Obviously, you'd give the edge to Franklin in that regard, but the bottom line is they got along famously. But Arthur Lee was very jealous of their relationship and did everything he could to not only divide Franklin and Deane, but he specifically targeted and tried to undermine Deane from the very outset. He sent malicious letters about Deane back to his brothers in the Continental Congress. And the Lees were very close to the Adams family with Samuel and John, who were cousins. And they got aboard with the Lees to wonder what was really behind these letters and that type of thing. And as it turns out, Arthur Lee was successful in getting Silas Deane, who had done all this work with Beaumarchais and Dion, to line up support from France to get it to us under the table very quietly. He was able to get Deane recalled and sent back to America. Well, what happened was that, in fact, then he turned his attention and attack on Benjamin Franklin. But Benjamin Franklin was a lot sharper than Arthur Lee and was able to turn the tables on Lee and get Lee dismissed. So there you have Franklin all by himself in France, trying to get France committed more than just giving their arms and ammunition, because they had jumped in with both feet to do that. But here you have Franklin being in the history books for the first time as being the person who got France involved, when in fact France jumped in with both feet, sending us everything: arms, ammunition, tents, uniforms, money, commodities, those types of things, but not French troops. So what happens is that they begin to put this action into play. And there became, I guess, beginning around March of 1777, after the first ship arrived in America with all those goods that you see on the slide, there was about 7 or 8 ships for the remainder of that year. And of course, they began continuing throughout the remainder of the war, lots of goods that the American troops could use. But if you look at it from the standpoint of that there's 12,000 muskets alone that are French-made Charlevilles from the Charleville factories, Washington only had about 15,000 troops at the time in New York. So there's 12,000 muskets, enough to fit out almost every one of them, plus the blankets and shoes and flints and uniforms, cloth for uniforms. If they captured it, if they had white uniforms in France, they could dye them with blue indigo. If they had red uniforms that they captured from the British, they could put blue in there and they turn out to be a brown color, which was many continental regiments had brown as their uniforms. In any event, there you have the port of Marseille, where the ships are leaving to come to America with these smuggled goods. Well, we also talked about, Lafayette getting involved, but what about the other technical support that they offered? We're still not talking about a body of troops, but we're talking about technical advisors. As I said earlier, we had no one in America who knew cavalry tactics to the extent that the French had. So Charles Armand Tuffet came over here to be one of our cavalry instructors. And of course, Pulaski was another one. Steuben was able to actually drill a professional army in place during the winter at Valley Forge. That wasn't the only winter, obviously, and also wasn't the most bitter winter, but he was able to drill troops at Valley Forge. Deportes was a brilliant engineer. How do you transport massive numbers of troops over rivers, streams, harbors, and through heavy, dense forests, and build fortifications in a siege manner for siege warfare? Deportes could offer that particular area of expertise. And of course, you got Baron de Kalb, who had fought in multiple wars in Europe and was really a genius at military strategy and the movement of troops on the battlefield. Not to mention the fact that financial support-wise, France provided the equivalent of about $29 billion in 2020 dollars. 29 billion is what they gave in the American Revolution, which nearly exceeded their entire budget in France. But the bottom line was that they were committed, so they gave coin as well. Well, France had 2 major requirements before committing French troops. We've already established the fact that it was very difficult to very difficult to commit troops because of the sensitivity of it. So they did everything to smuggle stuff under the table. But they wanted to know if we were real, whether this was just a spat between a parent and a child, whether we really were serious about breaking away from Great Britain, or they wanted to see something in writing. Prove to us that you're breaking away. So we had to give them a copy of our Declaration of Independence. Then they wanted to know, are you going to win any battles, or do we have to fight your war for you? Can you do it yourself, or what's your capability? And when we won that Battle of Saratoga, then they were in a position where they could actually commit troops. Well, they committed troops after the treaty was signed, of amity and commerce was signed in the alliance. The first French troops came over here under Admiral d'Estaing. He was also a general, but they couldn't work with General John Sullivan, and we just didn't have a very good relationship there. And when we had our joint effort to try to retake Newport, Rhode Island, that failed miserably. D'Estaing got very angry, left, went back to the West Indies. We begged and pleaded and grappled with him, tried to get him involved again. So he comes back when we try to retake Savannah a year later in September and October 1779. That fails because he can't work with General Benjamin Lincoln. And as a result, he leaves and he's gone forever. Now, that was a really odd situation for that to occur, but nevertheless, the track record now is no wins and 2 losses in terms of working with the French troops. Well, how did they help in other ways? Well, John Paul Jones was like a privateer paid by the Congress and taking money from France or anywhere else where he could get ships to be able to attack the British supply ships that were loaded up with goods for British soldiers in America. And he would lie in wait in the North Sea and the English Channel and attack those ships. And if he achieved a victory, then he would bring the goods over, the captured ship over to France, where they would give the military goods to Beaumarchais, destined for America. And then, of course, there would be opportunities for civilian goods to be distributed to the French, and they loved him as a result of it. Lafayette did take a 16th month of leave of 1779. There wasn't a lot of activity going on there, but when he went back to France, he was very popular, and he realized that D'Estaing's inability to work with the Americans was very, very serious. And so he pleaded with the king to try to send a French expeditionary force. He actually wanted to lead it himself, but the king wisely chose Rochambeau, who was the greatest general of his time in France, to come over with 5,400 troops. So Lafayette was instrumental in working that out. And then, of course, he comes back. Rochambeau arrives with his army in July of 1780. He encamps at the what's now Brown University. Then it was called the College of Rhode Island in Newport. He eventually meets with George Washington. They get along very, very well. Who was Rochambeau? Well, to cut right to the chase, of all the generals in the entire American Revolution, the American, the French, the British, the Spanish, whomever, Rochambeau was the best of the best of the best. He was way up there in terms of intelligence, brilliance, capabilities. He could do it all. And we were so fortunate to have him lead the French forces over here and work with George Washington, because he also knew how to be humble. And that was important with working with George Washington. Well, Washington had this obsession with New York. He had been humiliated there and defeated in multiple battles. And he was, defeated. He'd regroup. He'd wait for another time to attack. If he lost, he would regroup. And the fact is that he always had this penchant for wanting to get back at the British and retake New York. But basically, he abandoned his plans after Rochambeau wisely suggested that they try to entrap Cornwallis at Yorktown. There's more to that story, which I can answer in questions. But the bottom line is that they began to march south. And when they got to Baltimore and Elkton, Maryland, they decided to send a lot of the troops by ship, but the wagons and everything came by land down through Virginia. These are the routes that are shown by land and sea. And I'm not going to get into all those dates because they take too long, but the bottom line is they left the New York area in July, and they traveled all the way down here. And when they got here, obviously it was September. They began the siege. And as a benefit, the French Navy, commanded by Admiral de Grasse, was able to come up from the West Indies, allow their colleagues in the Spanish to look over the French sugar islands, come up here and stop the British supply fleet from resupplying Cornwallis at Yorktown. They were badly defeated. They went back to New York. The Chesapeake was therefore safe. And who was de Grasse? Well, he had worked actually with Rochambeau in rebuilding the Army and Navy after the 7 Years' War. Had a lot of experience in a lot of battles. And he was the right man at the right place at the right time when he came down here to America. Washington and Rochambeau planned their siege strategy, because obviously you had Deporté and other individuals who knew something about siege warfare. We knew very little about it, but were able to apply that, and the French were able to apply that and help the Americans. The siege of Yorktown, everything from the left, 2/3 all the way over till you see Lafayette's name there, was really the French encampment and French lines. And then you have the Americans encompassing redoubts number 9 and 10 to the York River. So we basically surrounded the encampment at Yorktown. Yorktown was it was the last major battle, but it wasn't the last battle of the war. It simply triggered peace talks. After that, the British people were very tired of what was going on in America with no war being won, which probably sounds familiar to a lot of us Americans. And it triggered peace talks. So what happened is that Rochambeau returned to France back in January of 1783. And the army still stayed here for a while in Yorktown, which probably kept their economy alive. And then Lafayette, of course, comes back in 1824 and he's like a rock star. He's like the Beatles in the early 70s or early 60s coming over here. Everybody wants to see him, visit him, because he's the young man who was the hero from France who came over here to help the American cause. And of course, we celebrated his 200th anniversary just recently, and we're still in the process of doing it. There is a monument across the street from the American Revolution Museum in Yorktown, which has the names of over 600 French officers and men who were killed in the Army and the Navy of France, helping us during the Battle of Yorktown. I guess my question to a live audience is, did we ever repay France? And sometimes people have a difficulty answering that question, but we did repay France for their support by helping them in World War I against the German occupation, and in World War II when we defeated the Nazis. It was the famous quote, "Lafayette, we are here," is when John J. Pershing led the American Expeditionary Force to help the French free themselves from German occupation in World War I. And Colonel Charles Stanton was the gentleman who proclaimed, "Lafayette, we are here." And there you see General Pershing saluting Lafayette's tomb in Paris today. So what did we learn today? To wrap up very quickly, France supported the American colonies, or basically the Americans, for two reasons: revenge and trade. Simple. A dummy trading company, Rodrigo Hortalis, was created to smuggle these arms to America. Silas Deane was the first American envoy to work with Beaumarchais. He's the guy who brought all these people over here. It wasn't Ben Franklin. He did all the heavy lifting before Franklin arrived. And of course, French aid arrived in the form of ammunition, tents, uniforms, money, military, infantry, artillery, others. The Declaration of Independence and the victory at Saratoga helped to convince France to commit troops. Prior to that, they jumped in with both feet and were providing us with everything else. The first French army came over here, did not do well at all, did not help us at all, failed to help. Our track record after that was 0 wins and 2 losses. It wasn't until the French Navy at the first Battle of the Capes and the second Battle of the Capes in Yorktown helped out, basically. And of course, the Expeditionary Force under Rochambeau and de Grasse were successful. So the final track record of the French working was 3 wins and 2 losses. If you're interested in learning more, I've got a number of books. Unlikely Allies is the finest book I've ever read about French involvement. Brothers in Arms and the American Revolution, World War, both of these books are excellent about the World War, not just France and Spain. Rochambeau has an excellent biography here by Jenny Jones Vale, and Charles Lewis did one on Admiral de Grasse. And then, of course, you have a terrific book on the Washington Rochambeau route, and a book by my good friend John Moss, On the Road to Yorktown. Nathaniel Philbrick and the Hurricane's Eyes, a very good book, as is The Guns of Independence. And that really wraps it up. So thank you very much. I hope I didn't go too far over the amount of time. So in any event, Cody, thank you for your patience, and I appreciate it. I'm sorry I went a little bit over.
No, not at all, Randy. I think we all enjoyed it, so I do appreciate all the great information you gave us. And folks, if you have any questions, now is the time to ask them. Randy also generously provided his website here for us, also his email, phone numbers, if you all have any questions, particularly if you're teachers looking to learn more about teaching the American Revolution in your class. Randy is your go-to guy for sure. Um, and right now, I don't see any questions popping up, Randy. So you must have been pretty thorough in your talk.
A lot of information to cover. There's no question about it. I went as quickly as I possibly could. I left out some details of some of those slides, but I wanted to move things relatively quickly because it was the French aid was much more complicated than people imagine. It just wasn't simply Ben Franklin wining and dining all the women over there in France and getting to know the king and buttering him up and that type of thing, and allowing the king to say, "Hey, I'm going to help you Americans." It was much more complicated than that. And there were a lot of unsung heroes behind the scenes that people simply don't know about. You won't find Beaumarchais or Silas Deane's name in the history books. You won't find any mention of the Quebec Act, but you will find, obviously, the Proclamation of 1763. So there's a lot of things that are left out in our narrative about French aid. France almost, along with Spain, pulled the plug on the entire thing in the summer of seven. They just signed an alliance in June of 1779 for France and Spain to work together, and then 6 months later they were thinking of pulling the plug. So
Wow.
Lafayette was instrumental in helping out. And another thing that people do not know is that de Grasse was instrumental in stopping in Havana and picking up tons of pesos to pay the French and American troops. Rochambeau gave his personal treasury to pay Washington's troops and the French, but that soon ran out. And so de Grasse was bringing the money. And so when Washington met with de Grasse on the York River on the flagship, the Valet de Paris, I imagine that the first thing Washington wanted to know is, show me the money.
Right.
I'm sure that's what he was interested in because his soldiers had not been paid. And France once again came to rescue there as well, as did Spain.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Randy, we actually have a couple questions coming in now.
Okay.
This one here is from Courtney. You can see it on your screen. She asked, this might be a complicated question, but I would like to know how different would the American Revolution be without the aid from the French?
Well, we would be colonies of Great Britain.
Hmm.
That's the simple answer. The French were instrumental in helping us, and I might add that it wasn't easy for us to work with the French. It was more on their end of their ability to adjust to working with us. Now, not every Frenchman could get along with Americans. As I said earlier, Admiral d'Estaing really didn't like the Americans. He looked down his nose on them, and that probably had a lot to do with why he couldn't get together and work closely with General John Sullivan when the French and Americans tried to work together and retake Newport, Rhode Island in 1778. Actually, Lafayette and Nathaniel Greene, one of Washington's closest generals, tried to go up to Newport and try to patch things up so that the Americans and French could work together, and they were unsuccessful. D'Estaing simply got angry and left, and so the same thing occurred when D'Estaing came back to try to work with Benjamin Lincoln and retaking Savannah. That didn't work, and so even at Yorktown, they didn't exactly have any hospitality tents in between the forces so they could go and enjoy each other's company. We had fought them tooth and nail in the French and Indian War, so there wasn't a lot of warm and fuzzies there between the Americans and the French. And the French were never interested in Mom Apple Pie and the flag in America. They were interested in getting back at the British. That was their sole mission. In fact, after the Battle of Yorktown, when the British and French officers got together, they actually had fought wars for centuries against each other, and they actually got along famously and were regaling each other about the wars that they had fought. And Washington was kind of on the sidelines there and got apparently very angry because the French and British were like old time's sake. Hey, we lost the battle. Maybe we'll win the next one. And Washington felt insulted. He thought he had every reason to believe that the Americans won the Battle of Yorktown as well. So there's these little things. You don't just easily, be friends or make nice with people that you've been warring against forever. And I don't think we would not have won our independence without French aid. If you look at the massive amount of supplies that they provided us, we didn't have any military armories. Those that we did start up were burned. by the British, we didn't have a navy. There's a lot that we had lacking that they provided technical expertise to us that allowed us to have an advantage and eventually win that war. It's more appropriate to say the Americans did not win it. It's more appropriate to say the British lost it.
Hmm. Well, great answer. Thank you. We've got another question here. This one's from Cheryl. She asked, how much did Spain and France communicate directly?
Well, you had two cousins on the throne of the Bourbon family, so I suspect there was a lot of go-between because they were allies. We also needed France also needed to open up a second front. They were obviously helping the Americans with arms, ammunition, tents, uniforms, and money, while the Americans fought the British in the Eastern Theater. With Monmouth, with Brandywine, with Germantown and Yorktown and other battles. But the Spanish also, under Galvez and other leaders, I might add, were also attacking the British, particularly in Florida, from the west. In fact, it was the Spanish that financed George Rogers Clark's expedition to the Northwest Territory, where he attacked Vincennes, Cahokia, and Kaskaskia. That was all financed by Spanish dollars. And a gentleman, an American, who helped be the go-between, a guy named Oliver Pollock, who was the equivalent of our Robert Morris and Haim Sullivan, who were involved as financiers of the American Revolution. So Spain and France communicated pretty closely. Otherwise, de Grasse would not have been able to leave the West Indies and leave the French sugar islands in the hands of the Spanish. So there was a lot of interaction between the two of them.
Mm-hmm. All right, great. And we've got one last question here, just a couple minutes, and then we're coming up on time. This one's from Patrick. Why do you think Dean is left out and Franklin is given the credit?
That's an excellent question. Dean eventually fell out of favor. Not only did he have to come back here because of being scandalized by Arthur Lee, but when he came back here, he continued to help the American cause as best he could, but he was asked by the Continental Congress to produce receipts. Well, he was sent over there as a spy. He didn't keep receipts, and he kept very few receipts. He was, when you don't want to have receipts of the interaction that occurs if you're on a secret mission. And so he had his enemies, people like Arthur Lee, and of course John Adams was strongly involved with the Lee family in their little junta or coalition. And so I think Dean was left out primarily because it was questionable about what his real intentions were. And the other thing is that he left America as being perceived as a traitor. After the Battle of Camden on August 16th, 1780, Dean was asked by somebody, what do you think about this? I mean, it looks like America's losing the war. And we were losing the war, by the way, before the Battle of Kings Mountain. He wrote a letter basically to this individual who said, I don't know, maybe we ought to make the best deal we can and try to salvage something out of this war, because you can't trust the French. I've been working with them. I've dealt with them. They're in it for themselves. They're not really because they love America. Lafayette may be the only true Francophile who loves, America, but you can't trust the others. And the guy sat on that letter until a few days after Yorktown. And then it became published in papers or whatever up and down the Eastern Seaboard. And it made it look like Dean, who wrote the letter that day when he wrote it, a year before. And so when that letter was brought out, that of Dean's true feelings about not being able to trust the French, and he was probably right at the time, the fact is everybody said, oh my God, the French helped us gain our independence. What are you doing, you traitor? That type of thing. So he really left. He got out of America quickly. He also had a good relationship actually with another guy named Benedict Arnold. That's another whole story that Arnold was vilified as well in many respects. But Dean goes back. He goes to England. He's back and forth between France and England for a while. Thomas Jefferson becomes Secretary of State. Wants to bring Dean back to talk about relations at that time with France because Dean knows a lot. And Dean is poisoned. We think he was poisoned on a ship coming back to America from the English Channel. So he dies and he's buried in a graveyard at Gravesend, I believe.
Wow. Well, Randy, I thank you for joining us again today and for answering all the great questions we've had from folks. And thank you all for tuning in to another episode of Red Hill Rediscovered. Again, we do these monthly, so we'll see you back again in February. So, Randy, thanks again a lot from all of us at Red Hill. And hey, have a good one.
Cody, thank you. And thank you to your viewers. Very much appreciate the opportunity.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.